In a world where the voices of the small and the quiet so often go unheard, there arose an 8-year-old girl named Jasmine Williams, a girl with dark, determined eyes and a heart that refused to be silenced. In the solemn hush of a Brooklyn courtroom, where marble walls had long borne witness to the weight of adult voices and the cold calculus of power, Jasmine stood up for her grandfather, Robert Williams, a man whose gentle hands had built a lifetime of service, but whose name now trembled under the shadow of an accusation. With nothing but a battered folder, an unwavering gaze, and the fierce belief that the truth could not be buried beneath the lies of those who thought themselves above reproach, Jasmine stepped into the light and turned an entire room of doubt into a place where justice was reborn in the most unlikely of voices. This is the story of a granddaughter's love, a family's unbroken bond, and the quiet revolution that begins when one small voice decides to speak. In a hushed courtroom in Brooklyn that afternoon, the air felt impossibly heavy, each breath weighed down by anticipation, when suddenly, amid the stony-faced attorneys and the solemn bench of Judge Carter, an 8-year-old girl stepped forward, clutching a battered manila folder brimming with neatly arranged papers and hastily scribbled notes, her small frame standing tall with an unshakable resolve as she addressed the courtroom with a voice that was at once tender and unwavering. "Your Honor, may I speak on behalf of my grandfather?" Her words hung in the silence like a sudden swell of wind through still air, drawing every pair of eyes to Jasmine Williams, an unanticipated presence that, in that moment, rendered the assembled throng silent in awe. The judge paused mid-stroke on his pen, lifting his gaze over the rim of his glasses, perplexed yet oddly intrigued. After 3 decades on the bench, he had never witnessed such courage from someone so young. Across the aisle, Prosecutor Richardson's posture stiffened. An imperceptible curl of contempt flickered at the corner of his mouth, as if he regarded Jasmine's plea as an unworthy interruption to his carefully constructed case. Yet, Jasmine remained composed, her demeanor hinting at wisdom far beyond her years. She spoke again, her voice steady. "My grandfather, Robert Williams, has always been a dedicated steward for our neighborhood's housing fund, doing this work without pay because he believes every family deserves a roof over their head. And now, he's being accused of stealing money from the very people he tried to help." At this point, the courtroom's walls seemed to lean in closer, as if the very building strained to hear every fragile syllable that left her lips. The hush was so profound that even the faint rustle of turning pages or the distant echo of footsteps in the corridor became startlingly loud. Jasmine took a slow breath and continued. "I know I'm supposed to be in school, but grandfather has heart problems, and this stress is hurting him." Her words, tempered with childlike sincerity, struck something deep within each listener, softening hardened expressions, prompting a collective shift toward empathy in the space. She raised the folder slightly, allowing everyone to glimpse the care with which she had prepared it. Manila tabs peeking out, edges of documents peeking showing highlights, newspaper articles clinging to the inside flap, and margin notes written in that unmistakable, looping hand of an 8-year-old. The juxtaposition of her tender age against the gravity of her mission was magnetic, intoxicating, as though time itself had slowed to witness the unfolding of a subtle but seismic challenge to convention. As Jasmine's gaze swept the room, from the skeptical jury members to the stoic court reporter, from the bailiff stationed near the door to the gallery of spectators who'd come expecting yet another dry hearing, she held everyone's attention with an almost regal calm. Even the judge's expression softened as he leaned forward slightly, curiosity piqued by the earnestness in her tone. Under his breath, he murmured, "Proceed." And Jasmine nodded, clasping her hands over the folder, her heart pounding in her chest, but her voice unwavering as she prepared to deliver the words that would set this entire courtroom on edge and begin to unravel a case built on suspicion rather than truth, prejudice rather than fact. As the judge granted permission in a quietly firm voice that carried both curiosity and caution, Jasmine Williams gently set the folder on the witness stand and, summoning every shred of composure, began to weave together the tapestry of a lifetime's worth of love, loss, and unyielding faith, explaining that her grandfather, Robert Williams, had risen before dawn each morning for the past 15 years, not for wealth, but to ensure safe, stable homes for low-income families in their tight-knit Brooklyn neighborhood, a mission he pursued without any compensation, driven by conviction that dignity and shelter were rights, not privileges. She described her own story, the sudden tragedy that took her parents away when she was just 6, the image seared into her memory of their car careening into a guardrail after an evening performance she'd prepared for them, and the silent nights that followed, the lingering emptiness in the house where laughter once lived. She recounted how her grandfather became both parent and protector, patiently guiding her through grief, never letting her sink into despair, reading court cases and pamphlets on civic law by lamplight so she could understand the world that had taken her family, teaching her that knowledge was a shield and compassion a sword, preparing her unknowingly for this moment. She paused to show the judge a faded photo of the two of them seated at their kitchen table one Sunday evening, each carefully sorting colored slips of paper, blue envelopes representing expenses, yellow ones for income. Her small hand resting in his wizened yet steady one, the sun setting behind them. The photo captured a bond forged in respect, trust, and shared purpose. The singular time they spent outside of volunteer meetings, but rooted in service nonetheless. Jasmine then gently opened to a page of tabulated receipts she had annotated in her own careful script, highlighting one entry dated September 12th, in which $2,500 was withdrawn for emergency roofing repairs. Yet, when she visited the community center the following day with her grandfather, they discovered the roof remained intact. No signs of patching, peeling shingles, or a ladder leaning against the wall, just the sound of children's laughter echoing through empty rooms. She explained how she cross-referenced that date with her grandfather's medical visits. He accompanied her to the hospital at precisely that time because she had experienced a sudden asthma attack, her small chest heaving with each breath. And he never left her side until the doctor secured an inhaler and monitored her till the board of nurses declared she was stable. She produced an official document, time-stamped 2:45 p.m. on September 12th, showing both she and her grandfather in the emergency waiting room, names printed clearly, a cold, clear piece of evidence that shattered the assertion he had been anywhere near the building from which funds were allegedly taken. Jasmine paused, her eyes bright as she recalled another withdrawal, $1,800 earmarked for security equipment made on September 18th. But when they walked through the center's empty hallways, the lights were dim, the doors unlocked, and no boxes, cables, or alarm panels could be found. She had even visited a security firm the next day and asked if they had installed any such system, only to be told, "There's been no installation this month." She closed her eyes briefly, steadying her voice for the next revelation. A $3,200 payment to an outside legal counsel dated September 25th. Jasmine recalled how she had overheard her grandfather speaking to a retired lawyer friend, assuring him they didn't need to hire more attorneys because the pro bono group he belonged to would handle any legal issues free of charge, and yet the funds in question had no matching invoices or receipts. Turning gently to address the jury, she spoke softly. "I know it seems unbelievable that someone who spent his life fighting for justice would be framed, but I promise you, he didn't hire outside lawyers, and neither did our apartment building." The room remained utterly still, save for the steady pulse of silence, thick with implication. Jasmine then confessed that she had spent countless nights studying handwriting analysis using children's guides from the public library, and, though still learning, she could detect the difference between her grandfather's gentle, rounded signature and the forced too-firm letters scrawled on the questionable documents. She displayed side-by-side comparisons, her grandfather's written name, soft as a brushstroke, next to a bold, uncertain forgery, uneven, jagged, betraying pressure where there should have been grace. The jurors leaned forward, straining to see, to understand what this tiny expert was revealing through her painstaking research. And suddenly, Jasmine paused again to draw attention to the fact that none of this information had come from the state's initial disclosure. They had withheld these inconsistencies. Her voice did not waver. "I have no stake in this case, except truth. I just want the person who did this to be held accountable, but not at the cost of my grandfather's reputation." A tear welled in her eye as she reflected on how her grandfather once said, "When you're right, no one can argue with your silence or your tears." Jasmine gently closed her folder, allowing the weight of her own words to rest in the quiet that settled over the room. In that moment, even Prosecutor Richardson looked less certain, his jaw clenched, his posture no longer confident. Jasmine's heartbeat slowed in her chest, and she waited for judgment. for acknowledgement, for the moment when justice might meet innocence in a place that had once seemed rigid, unyielding, and poised to destroy Dot. As the courtroom held its collective breath in that fragile silence, Jasmine took another deep, steadying breath, her small fingers brushing over the edge of the worn manila folder that had become a testament to her unwavering devotion and quiet brilliance, and she began to tell them about the woman who had become her unexpected guide. Mrs. Harriet, a retired librarian who had once spent decades in the dusty, labyrinthine corners of law offices before she found her calling in the hushed reverence of the public library's legal reference section. Jasmine explained how, on one rainy Thursday afternoon when she had timidly approached the counter, asking for books on civil procedure, Mrs. Harriet had seen something in her eyes, a mixture of desperation and determination that no child should ever have to carry alone, and without hesitation had offered her the patient wisdom of years spent untangling the dense, impenetrable jargon of legalese. She painted the picture for the jury, how they would meet at a table near the back of the library, surrounded by yellowed tomes and the soft glow of reading lamps, as Mrs. Harriet, her hair a halo of silver, would lean forward, tracing the outlines of cases with a wrinkled but steady finger, teaching Jasmine to see beyond the ink and paper, to find the gaps, the inconsistencies, the places where the truth might be hiding in plain sight. Jasmine's voice, though small, was clear as a bell as she told them how those hours in the library had given her the strength to sit here today, not just as a child defending her grandfather, but as someone who believed that even in the face of overwhelming doubt, justice could still be found if you dared to look deeper. She described how, every evening after school, she would rush to the library, her backpack thudding softly against her shoulders as she took the stairs 2 at a time, her breath quick with the thrill of purpose, of knowing that with every carefully read page, she was one step closer to saving the man who had saved her from grief. Jasmine spoke of the nights when she would return home to find her grandfather asleep in his chair, the faint glow of the television flickering across his weathered face. And she would tiptoe past him, her mind still echoing with the lessons Mrs. Harriet had shared, lessons about how even the most tangled web of lies could be undone if you had the courage to tug at the threads. Her words wove a quiet spell over the room, and even the skeptical glances of the jury began to soften, to waver, as they realized they were witnessing something rare and powerful, a child's steadfast belief in the possibility of truth prevailing over prejudice. Jasmine then told them how, during one late-night session at the library, Mrs. Harriet had said, "Child, they will try to tell you that your age is a limitation, that your color is a stain, that your voice is too small to matter. But remember, the law is supposed to be a tool for everyone, not just those who have the power to bend it to their will." It was that lesson that had carried Jasmine through the sleepless nights when fear threatened to creep in, that had steadied her hand when she took notes on every suspicious transaction, every half-truth that Prosecutor Richardson had tried to pass off as fact. She described how she had learned to separate her grief from her clarity, to set aside her pain like a delicate ornament on a shelf, so she could focus on what mattered most, proving her grandfather's innocence, not because she was naive, but because she refused to let the lies win. Jasmine told them about the morning she discovered the first piece of real evidence, a faded ledger entry that didn't match any known invoice, and how her heart had pounded in her chest as she realized that she wasn't just imagining things, that the truth was there, waiting to be found. She shared how she had carefully documented every discrepancy, every gap in the official story, using color-coded tabs and margin notes in a script that was small and meticulous, a child's careful scrawl that had become her shield and her sword. She told them how she had memorized every date, every number, every name, until she could recite them in her sleep, because she knew that she only had one chance to convince them, to make them see past her small stature, past the soft cadence of her voice, to the unassailable logic of what she had uncovered. Her voice faltered for a brief moment as she recounted how, the night before the hearing, she had sat with her grandfather, his hand resting on her shoulder, and he had whispered, "Jasmine, you've done more than I ever could have asked. No matter what happens tomorrow, I am proud of you." She paused to let the words sink in, her gaze sweeping across the room, lingering on each face as if to draw them into the weight of that promise. Jasmine then fixed her eyes on Prosecutor Richardson, her expression unflinching as she spoke directly to him, her words laced with a quiet fire. "You built this case on assumptions, but I built my case on facts. You never looked beyond the surface because you didn't think you had to, but I did because I had to." The hush that followed was not just silence, it was a reckoning, a moment in which the walls themselves seemed to lean closer, listening for the truth that had eluded them for too long. And in that moment, Jasmine Williams, just 8 years old, stood not as a child lost in the shadows of a system that had failed too many like her, but as a beacon of what could happen when love and knowledge joined forces, refusing to be silenced. The room seemed to hold its breath as Jasmine took another slow, deliberate breath, her small hands pressing gently against the folder, as if drawing courage from its carefully curated pages. And she continued in that clear, ringing voice that carried not only the innocence of her years, but the unwavering conviction of someone who had already weathered storms no child should ever have to face, telling them how, on the day of the alleged theft, her grandfather Robert had been at her side the entire time, his hand never leaving hers as she struggled to breathe in the cold, antiseptic corridors of Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, the rhythmic beeping of monitors a sharp counterpoint to the warmth of his unwavering presence, and how she had watched his eyes flicker with worry, never once betraying the stoic calm he wore like armor whenever he stepped into the world on her behalf. She described how she remembered the smell of the hand sanitizer and the soft creak of vinyl chairs, how she had pressed her face into his coat and felt the thud of his heart against her cheek, a steady rhythm that anchored her in that terrifying moment when she thought she might slip away, and how she knew with every fiber of her being that he had not been signing checks or meeting strangers in some backroom office because he was too busy holding her hand and whispering that everything would be all right. Jasmine paused to show the judge the medical record she had retrieved with Mrs. Harriet's help, her small fingers smoothing the creases as she turned the page to reveal the official timestamp, 2:45 p.m. On September 12th, the precise moment the money was supposedly withdrawn, and the jury leaned forward, eyes scanning the document with a mixture of disbelief and dawning understanding. For here, in the neat rows of printed text and doctor's signatures, lay the irrefutable truth that her grandfather had not been anywhere near the community center's offices that afternoon, and no amount of disbelief or prejudice could erase that fact. She spoke then of the phone call she had placed just days ago to the security company that managed the center's cameras, her voice shaking only slightly as she asked them if the cameras were really down on September 12th, and how the man on the other end had said, "No, little lady, the cameras were working just fine, and we still have the footage if anyone wants to see it." And she had thanked him with a polite smile that belied the racing of her heart, knowing that each new piece of evidence was another brick in the wall of truth she was building around her grandfather's innocence. Jasmine turned then to Prosecutor Richardson, who sat rigid in his chair, his face a mask of forced indifference, though she could see the faint glimmer of sweat along his temple, and she said, softly but with unwavering resolve, "You said in your opening statement that the case was open and shut, that my grandfather was the only one with access, and therefore he must be guilty. But you never asked where he was or who he was with because you didn't think it mattered, because you thought no one would question you when you accused an old black man of stealing from his own people. But I'm questioning you now because I know where he was. He was with me, and I needed him, and he never left my side, not for a single second." The courtroom remained silent, every ear straining to catch her every word, and even Judge Carter's normally impassive face had softened, his eyes reflecting something like respect, or perhaps a glimmer of hope, as he watched this small girl stand so firmly in the place where grown men so often faltered. Jasmine's voice wavered only briefly as she described how, in the nights after the charges were filed, she would hear her grandfather pacing the kitchen, the low murmur of his voice as he read through the accusations, and how she would lie in bed clutching her grandmother's old quilt, fighting the urge to run to him and promise that she would find a way to fix it all. Because even though she was only 8, she understood that sometimes love meant carrying the burdens that others could not bear alone. She told them how she had learned to read financial statements by flashlight, cross-referencing every entry until her eyes burned and her head throbbed. But she had refused to give up because she knew that each line she understood was another thread she could pull to unravel the web of lies that threatened to strangle them. And as she spoke, The weight of her words pressed against the walls of that courtroom, filling every corner with the quiet power of a child's determination to speak the truth in a world that had tried so hard to teach her to remain silent. She turned back to the judge then, her voice as soft as it was unyielding, and said, "Your Honor, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not pretending to be one, but I know the difference between right and wrong, and I know that my grandfather didn't do this, because he taught me that real strength doesn't come from power or titles. It comes from the courage to stand up for what's right, even when you're scared, even when you're small." The hush that followed was electric, every breath in the room drawn tight with the knowledge that something extraordinary was unfolding before their eyes. And in that hush, Jasmine Williams, no taller than the back of the witness chair, no older than a single-digit birthday, had become something bigger than herself. She had become the voice of every child who had ever been told they were too young, too poor, too black to matter, and in that moment, she was unstoppable. Jasmine could feel the hush deep in her bones as she gently closed the medical record that she'd presented, her small hand lingering over the date as if to seal the truth into the room's memory. And she spoke again. Her voice, carrying the weight of a lifetime lived in the shadows of other people's assumptions, explaining that her grandfather had never been the kind of man who would take what did not belong to him, that he had spent every waking moment since she could remember helping others, fixing broken faucets for widows, patching leaky roofs with money from his own pocket, and never once asking for thanks because, to him, dignity was something that didn't need a receipt or a signature. Jasmine's eyes glistened as she told them about the community center he had fought to keep open, how he had taught her to sweep the floors before the meetings began, his broad hands guiding hers on the broom's handle, telling her that every corner matters when you're cleaning up someone else's mess. And she had always known he meant more than just dust and dirt. He meant the injustices that seeped in through the cracks when no one was watching, the lies that could spread like mold if you didn't scrub them clean with vigilance and love. She said this softly but with a firmness that carried across the room like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. And even the court stenographer paused for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keys, as if to savor the certainty in Jasmine's words. Then Jasmine leaned forward, her small shoulders squaring in the oversized witness chair, and she spoke of the day she found the first real clue, how she had noticed that the handwriting on the suspicious checks was too stiff, too heavy, the loops too tight, and the pressure too deep, nothing like the gentle curves of her grandfather's signature she had watched him write so many times at the kitchen table, always with a soft breath and a steady hand, because he said that even a signature was a promise, a mark of your character left behind for the world to see. She described how she had learned the basics of handwriting, analysis from books misses. Harriet had given her how she had spent hours poring over examples, tracing the shapes of letters in the margins of her notebooks, until she could see the difference even with her eyes closed. She said, "I'm just a child, but even I can see what's true when it's right in front of me." And she held up the copies she had made, one of her grandfather's real signature, flowing and calm, and one of the forged ones, jagged and tense, as if the hand that made them was forcing them into existence. The jury leaned in closer, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief as they took in the clear, careful comparisons she had assembled, the color-coded tabs that marked each critical discrepancy like beacons of light in the sea of confusion Richardson had tried to create. Jasmine's gaze turned to Richardson then, her voice quiet but edged with steel as she said, "You didn't check because you didn't care who the real criminal was. You only cared that you could blame someone who couldn't fight back." And the words fell into the room like a stone into water, sending ripples through every corner of the hushed courtroom, challenging the very foundation of the case Richardson had thought unassailable. She paused, letting the silence stretch out, letting everyone in the room feel the gravity of what she had just said. And in that pause, even the judge seemed to lean forward a fraction, as if to hear not just her words but the deeper resonance of what she represented, a defiance of the smallness they had tried to force upon her, a refusal to let their dismissal of her age or her color define the boundaries of her power. Jasmine continued, her breath steady, her words weaving a tapestry of evidence and memory that no one could ignore, recounting how she had visited the center herself on the days the fraudulent payments were allegedly made, how she had walked those same worn floors and seen with her own eyes that nothing had changed. No new security cameras blinking in the corners, No fresh paint on the walls, no evidence of any repairs or upgrades that could justify the money that had vanished into the ether. She told them how she had spoken to the staff, the volunteers who had worked alongside her grandfather for years, and how they had all shaken their heads, saying that they had never seen any of the work that was supposed to have been done. And as she spoke, her voice didn't quaver, her words didn't falter, because she knew with the certainty of a child who has learned to trust her own eyes and her own heart, that the truth she was telling was bigger than her small voice, bigger even than the walls of the courtroom that had once seemed so cold and impenetrable. She finished that part of her story with a soft exhale, her fingers still resting on the folder, and she looked at the judge, her dark eyes reflecting not just fear or defiance, but a quiet, unbreakable conviction as she said, "I may be small, but the truth isn't, and I won't let it be buried." The room was silent for a moment longer, and in that silence, Jasmine felt something shift, like the first crack of sunlight breaking through storm clouds, a tiny promise that even the most stubborn shadows couldn't last forever. Jasmine paused for a moment, letting her last words hang in the air like the soft echo of a bell in a cavern, and then she took another breath and began to speak again, her voice calm but unwavering as she recounted how she had sat in the quiet corners of the library with Mrs. Harriet, poring over books not meant for children, tracing the fine lines of legal precedent with her small finger, and learning how to see through the maze of words that adults often use to hide the truth, and how each new fact she uncovered was like a bright thread she could pull from the tapestry of lies they had tried to weave around her grandfather, and how she had learned that no matter how complicated the law might seem, it was still built on simple questions. Who was there? What was real? And what was fair? She spoke of how she had learned to ask those questions, not just to Richardson, but to herself, because she knew that the truth wasn't just a pile of papers or numbers on a spreadsheet. It was in the details that people overlooked, the places where facts and hearts met, and she had found those places one by one in the small hours of the night when she should have been sleeping, driven by a love so fierce it refused to be quieted by exhaustion or fear. Jasmine turned her eyes back to the jury, her voice softening for a moment as she said, "I know it's hard to believe that someone my age could find these things, but I didn't do it alone. Mrs. Harriet taught me that justice is never about one person. It's about everyone who believes in it and is willing to fight for it, no matter how small they feel." And she let the words settle into the stillness of the room, filling it with the gentle certainty of her conviction. She then carefully unfolded another sheet of paper from the folder, this one with careful notations in red ink she had written herself, showing the timeline of every withdrawal, every discrepancy, every place where the official story didn't match what she and her grandfather had lived, and as she pointed out each inconsistency, her small hand tracing each line like the stroke of a violin bow, the jurors watched with an intensity that spoke of something deeper than curiosity, something closer to awe. Even Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin, his eyes never leaving the small figure who had become the center of gravity in a room built to contain grown men and their ironclad arguments. Jasmine described how on September 25th, when the largest withdrawal was made, $3,200 for outside legal counsel, her grandfather had been home with her, helping her with a history project for school, how he had gone over every note she wrote and reminded her that the past is what we learn from, so we don't make the same mistakes again, and how she knew that on that day he had never even left the apartment because she had watched him from across the kitchen table, her book spread out like a small fortress between them, as he taught her that history isn't just about dates, it's about people who refuse to forget. She lifted her gaze to Richardson, whose face had begun to pale, and she said, "You didn't ask anyone about that day because you didn't want to hear the answers." And the calm in her voice was like a quiet wave washing over the courtroom, eroding the foundations of his case with each measured syllable. She went on to describe how she had called the security company herself, her small voice polite but persistent, as she asked them if the cameras were really broken like the prosecutor claimed, and how the man on the other end had sounded surprised, telling her that they had never been asked for any footage by the district attorney's office, and that the tapes from those days still existed, waiting to be seen by anyone who cared enough to look. Jasmine paused then, her small shoulders rising with a deep breath as she said, "I care enough to look, and I hope you do too." And the words were a soft challenge that made even the clerk's pen pause in midair. She spoke of how she had found the evidence of the phone call that had been made from the housing fund's account on the very day the money disappeared, how she had traced it to the exact minute when her grandfather was with her in the hospital, and how she had found the medical report that proved he couldn't have been in two places at once, a simple fact that no one had bothered to check because they had all been too ready to believe the worst of an old black man who had never once failed his community. Her eyes turned to the jury, wide and clear, as she said, "He was with me, and that's the truth." And the honesty in her voice was like a spark in dry grass, catching light in the hearts of everyone who heard it. She spoke of how she had watched her grandfather's shoulders bend under the weight of the accusations, how she had seen the way he tried to hide his worry behind gentle smiles and quiet reassurances, and how she had known that if she didn't stand up for him now, he might never be able to stand tall again, not because he was guilty, but because the world had already decided he was. Jasmine's words flowed like a river, carrying them all with her on the current of her fierce, quiet determination. And in that current was the truth that no one could deny, that she had done the work they had failed to do, that she had asked the questions they had been too proud or too blind to consider, and that she had done it all not out of vengeance, but out of love. Love for the man who had held her hand when she couldn't breathe. Love for the truth that had been left to die in the dark. And in that love, there was a power that no one in the room could deny, a power that shimmered in the tears that began to gather in the corners of the jurors' eyes, in the quiet that had settled like a blessing over the courtroom, in the simple, unshakable knowledge that the smallest voice can still echo with the force of justice when it refuses to be silenced. As Jasmine let her final words of that moment settle over the courtroom like the hush of a cathedral at midnight, she took another slow breath, her small chest rising and falling beneath the neat collar of her dress. And then she reached for the last envelope she had tucked away in her folder, her fingers brushing over the crease, as if to gather the courage she had carefully nurtured over long nights spent in the lamplight of the library and the quiet strength of whispered stories at her grandfather's knee. She paused, her wide eyes lifting to meet the gaze of the judge, of the jury, of every pair of eyes that had turned from mild curiosity to rapt attention, as she said softly, "I have one last thing to show you, something that I didn't find in a book or on a bank statement, but something that proves what my grandfather has always taught me, that when you love someone, you don't let them stand alone, not ever." She opened the envelope with a care that belied her youth, drawing out a single sheet of paper, an official bank statement with a line item that glowed with quiet menace in the sterile light of the courtroom. A $25,000 transfer into Prosecutor Richardson's own personal account, dated just days after the charges were first filed against her grandfather. A murmur swept through the room like a sudden wind in a still grove, and for the first time, Richardson's mask of bored superiority slipped, his face paling to the color of old ash, his hand twitching on the table before him as if to snatch the paper from her grasp. But Jasmine did not waver. She held it out, steady as a surgeon's hand, and her voice did not crack as she said, "This money came from the same company that received the payments for the fake repairs and the so-called legal help. The same company that was supposed to be fixing our community center's roof when nothing was ever fixed. I found it because I wouldn't stop looking, because I knew the truth had to be somewhere, and I wasn't afraid to find it." The jury leaned forward, the judge's eyes narrowed as he read the line on the page, and even the clerk's pen hesitated in midair, as if the entire courtroom had become a single breath, waiting. Jasmine turned her gaze back to Richardson then, her voice as gentle as it was unyielding. "You said this was an open and shut case, but you didn't tell them it was because you were the one who wanted it closed as quickly as possible, because you had something to hide. You didn't tell them that you were the one who took the money that should have been used to keep families warm and safe." She let the silence stretch again, knowing that sometimes the quiet spoke louder than any accusation. And in that silence, Richardson looked down, his jaw tight, sweat beading at his hairline as the truth he had tried so hard to bury rose up around him like the tide. Jasmine spoke then, her words soft but sure, the weight of 1,000 nights spent in the glow of borrowed books and whispered promises holding her steady as she said, "I'm just a child, and I don't know all the rules of this room, but I know that stealing from people who trust you is wrong, and lying about it is worse. My grandfather never did either of those things. He taught me that justice doesn't wear a fancy suit or speak in a loud voice. It lives in the small choices we make every day, in the promises we keep even when no one is watching. Her words settled like dust on old wood, the kind of truth that can't be scrubbed away, and in that moment, even Judge Carter's stern mouth softened into something that might have been pride, or perhaps even the first glimmer of respect for the girl who had turned his courtroom into a sanctuary for honesty. Jasmine looked back at the jury, her small hands still holding the paper, like it was both shield and sword, and she said, "I know I'm not supposed to be the one standing here. I know it's supposed to be grown-ups with degrees and titles. But sometimes the people who see the most are the ones who don't know all the words, because they're the ones who never stop asking questions." She let the quiet swell again, the air heavy with the weight of revelation, and in that quiet, she felt her grandfather's presence beside her, the steady hand that had taught her to see the world as it was and to believe that it could be better. She took a final breath, her voice no louder than a whisper, but strong enough to fill the room as she said, "I did this because I love my grandfather, and because I believe that if you have the truth in your hands, you have to hold it up for everyone to see, no matter how small you are or how scared you feel." And as she lowered her gaze, her eyes shimmering but dry, the hush in the room shifted from doubt to something closer to reverence, because in that moment, beneath the fluorescent lights and the weight of centuries of injustice, Jasmine Williams had become not just a witness, not just a granddaughter, but the living embodiment of a promise that even the smallest voice can speak the loudest truth. As Jasmine stood there, her tiny shoulders squared against the weight of the room's silence, her grandfather Robert, seated just feet away in the defendant's chair, watched her with eyes that shone like polished mahogany, each word she spoke carving away at the falsehoods that had tried to strangle his name. And though he had remained silent throughout this trial, his heart was a storm of gratitude and pride as he realized that his granddaughter had become the very strength he once promised her she would never need to find alone. Jasmine, her dark curls framing a face set with unwavering resolve, gently tucked the damning bank statement back into her folder, and she raised her gaze once more, turning to the judge, whose lined face had softened with every revelation she had laid bare, and she said, her voice tender but resolute, "Your Honor, I know that what I've shown you might seem like a lot to come from someone my age, but everything I've learned because I wanted to understand how to protect the people I love. My grandfather taught me that the truth is never small, even when the one who holds it is." She paused, letting the truth of that statement settle into the quiet, a quiet that no longer felt cold and indifferent, but alive with a kind of electricity, and then she spoke again, turning her gaze back to Richardson, whose shoulders had begun to slump beneath the weight of his own unraveling deception. "I know that you didn't expect to have to answer to someone like me," she said, her voice so gentle that it carried the weight of a whisper but the bite of steel. "But you do, because I'm not here to make you look small. I'm here to remind you that even when you think no one is watching, someone always is." The jurors shifted, some exchanging glances that spoke of awakening conscience, others blinking rapidly as they absorbed the truth that had been laid out before them, not by a lawyer in an expensive suit, but by a child who had taught them all what justice truly looked like. Jasmine took a small breath, her hands trembling just slightly as she gathered her final notes, and she said softly, "I didn't do any of this to hurt you or to embarrass you. I did it because I love my grandfather, and because I believe that when someone is innocent, they deserve to be heard, no matter how many people tell them they're too small to matter." She let the quiet settle once more, her small fingers brushing across the folder's worn cover as she drew in a breath to steady herself. "I didn't come here to be brave," she confessed, in a voice that was no less steady for the tears that threatened to well in her eyes. "I came here because I couldn't let the people who trust my grandfather be left to wonder if he was the kind of man who would ever betray them, because he isn't. He never was." She turned then to the jury, her gaze unwavering as she said, "I've shown you everything I have, everything I've learned, everything I've found, because I believe that if you look at it with open eyes and open hearts, you'll see what I see, that my grandfather isn't the one who stole that money. He's the one who was always there, always helping, always giving, even when no one asked him to." She paused, her small chin lifting with a quiet pride as she added, "And if you see that, then maybe you'll understand that the truth doesn't care how old you are or what color your skin is. It only cares that you're willing to fight for it." Her words settled like a warm blanket across the courtroom, and for a moment, Even the harsh fluorescent lights seemed softer, the walls themselves bending closer to listen. Jasmine let her hands drop to her sides, the folder finally resting on the wooden railing in front of her, and she looked back at the judge, who had not looked away once since she began to speak. He cleared his throat, his voice gruff but kind as he said, "Miss Williams, you have shown this court something that goes beyond evidence or testimony. You have shown us what it means to stand for someone you love, and that is a lesson none of us will soon forget." Jasmine nodded once, her small shoulders relaxing as the judge turned his gaze to Richardson, whose face was a portrait of defeat and dread. The once arrogant prosecutor, now nothing more than a man who had been caught in the snare of his own corruption. In that moment, Jasmine felt a quiet triumph bloom in her chest. Not the triumph of vengeance, but the triumph of knowing that she had not let her grandfather's kindness be buried beneath the weight of someone else's greed. She turned back to her grandfather then, their eyes meeting across the courtroom, and in that silent exchange, he mouthed two words that only she could see: "Thank you." And in that thank you was everything. Every story he had told her, every lesson he had whispered in the quiet hours, every night he had spent sitting by her bed to chase away the nightmares she never spoke of. Jasmine felt a warmth spread through her chest as she lowered her eyes, her heart steady and sure in the knowledge that no matter what came next, she had already done what she came here to do. She had made them see him through her eyes, and in those eyes, he was never anything but innocent. As Jasmine stood there in the charged quiet of the courtroom, her heart steady despite the weight of what she had just revealed, she felt a subtle shift in the air, a collective exhale that swept through the jury, through the spectators who had come expecting a trial like any other, but were now witnessing something altogether different, something that felt like the first true taste of justice. She took a breath, her small hands closing around the edges of her folder, as if to anchor herself to the truth she had laid bare, and then she turned her gaze once more to the judge, her voice soft but resolute as she said, "Your Honor, I know I'm not supposed to be the one who decides what happens here, but I believe that if the truth matters at all, then my grandfather deserves to walk out of this courtroom with his name cleared and his head held high." Her words were simple, unadorned, yet they carried the weight of every late night she had spent poring over documents, every question she had dared to ask in a world that had tried so hard to tell her she was too small to be heard. The judge met her gaze for a long moment, the lines around his eyes deepening with something like quiet admiration, and then he nodded, his voice grave as he said, "Miss Williams, this court has heard your words, and we will consider them with the care and respect they deserve." Jasmine let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, a small, trembling exhale that carried with it the echo of every doubt she had fought to silence in her own heart, and she turned back to her grandfather, who sat watching her with tears bright in his dark eyes, his weathered hands clasped in his lap as if in silent prayer. In that moment, the room around them seemed to shrink, the walls pressing closer in a hush that felt almost sacred, and Jasmine could feel the truth of it all settle into her bones like a warm light, that she had done what no one else could or would, that she had made them see the man she knew so well, the man who had never once let her down, even when the world seemed determined to prove that people like them didn't belong in places like this. She stepped back from the witness stand then, her small feet carrying her with the quiet grace of someone who had learned that courage wasn't about being unafraid, but about standing anyway, even when your knees wanted to buckle. The judge cleared his throat, his gavel resting gently on the worn wood of his bench, and turned to Richardson, whose face was now a mask of pale desperation, the sweat on his forehead a testament to the walls closing in around him. "Mr. Richardson," the judge said, his voice calm but implacable, "you have heard the testimony of this witness, and you have been confronted with evidence that calls into question not only the charges you have brought, but the integrity of the investigation itself. Do you have any response?" Richardson swallowed hard, his throat working as he rose to his feet, his shoulders hunched as if he could make himself small enough to escape the eyes now fixed on him. "Your Honor," he began, his voice cracking at the edges, I never intended for this to happen. I was under pressure. I thought it would be easier to close the case quickly, to show results, to keep my record clean." His words faltered under the weight of what he had done, and he looked down at the floor as if the truth there was too bright to face. The jury watched in a kind of stunned silence, the slow unraveling of a man who had once held the power of the state in his hands, but had squandered it in service of his own ambition. Jasmine watched too, her small face calm, but her dark eyes bright with a kind of quiet triumph, because she knew that this wasn't just about clearing her grandfather's name. It was about showing that the truth, no matter how small it seemed or how young the voice that carried it, could still stand tall against even the most carefully constructed lies. The judge let the silence stretch for a moment longer, the weight of it pressing down on the room until it felt like the very walls might crack. And then he said, his voice firm but gentle, "This court will take a brief recess before I render my decision. Miss Williams, thank you for your courage and your clarity. You may return to your seat." Jasmine nodded, her small hands brushing across the folder one last time as she stepped down from the witness stand. And as she walked back to her grandfather's side, she felt his hand find hers, warm and steady, the same hand that had guided her through every storm she had ever faced. He squeezed her fingers gently, a silent promise that no matter what came next, they would face it together. And she squeezed back, a wordless vow that she would never stop fighting for him, or for the truth he had taught her to believe in. And in that quiet exchange, as the courtroom slowly emptied for the recess, Jasmine felt a sense of peace settle into her chest. A peace born not from victory, but from the knowledge that she had done everything she could, that she had spoken every word that needed to be spoken, and that sometimes that was enough to begin to heal even the oldest wounds. As the courtroom slowly emptied for the short recess, Jasmine sat back in her seat, her small hands still warm from her grandfather's grasp, her heart beating in a steady rhythm that echoed in her ears as she watched the jurors file out with thoughtful expressions, their eyes flicking back to her as if they carried the memory of every word she had spoken like a quiet refrain. The judge rose from his bench, his black robe billowing softly as he turned away for a moment, his shoulders heavy with the knowledge that what he had just witnessed was not merely a presentation of evidence, but a testament to the power of truth spoken without fear. And in that pause, the weight of years and precedent seemed to settle around him like a mantle he could not shrug off. Jasmine's grandfather leaned forward slightly, his rough, work-worn hands trembling as he reached out to tuck a stray curl behind her ear, his voice no more than a whisper as he said, "You have done more for me than I ever could have dreamed, Jasmine. No matter what happens now, you have given me back my dignity." His words were a balm against the sting of the long days that had come before, the days when he had walked with his head bowed under the burden of an accusation. He could not fight alone, and in that moment, Jasmine felt something in her chest uncoil, some small knot of fear and doubt that had lived there for weeks, maybe years, finally beginning to loosen as she met his gaze and whispered, "I promised you, Grandpa. I promised you I wouldn't let them forget who you really are." Around them, the buzz of quiet conversation began to rise, the low hum of voices as reporters whispered to one another, their pens poised to capture the story of the little girl who had stood against the full weight of a system that had almost crushed her grandfather. And Jasmine watched them with a calm that belied her age, her dark eyes steady and unblinking, because she knew that the story they would write was only the surface of what had really happened here. Beneath the headlines and the speculation was a simple truth. That love, when it was fierce and patient, could be a force greater than any courtroom's walls. Across the aisle, Richardson sat slumped in his chair, his eyes red-rimmed and his hands clenching and unclenching, as if he could still hold onto the tatters of his once impeccable reputation. And Jasmine felt no triumph in seeing him brought low, only a quiet sorrow that someone who had once held the power to protect others had chosen instead to protect only himself. She turned her gaze away from him then, her thoughts drifting back to the hours she had spent with Mrs. Harriet in the library's dusty corners, the soft rustle of pages and the quiet encouragement of the woman who had become her mentor and friend, and she thought about how those evenings had shaped her into the girl she was now, someone who believed that even the smallest voice could become a storm if it refused to be silenced. Jasmine's grandfather squeezed her hand again, his fingers rough and familiar, and she leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment, letting the scent of his old work jacket, faint soap and the warm smell of home, fill her senses, and remind her that no matter how fierce the fight, she had never been alone. Outside the tall windows of the courtroom, the late afternoon light slanted in golden bars, and Jasmine watched the dust motes dance in the beam, her mind turning over the next steps, the next questions. Because even as the evidence she had presented lay like an undeniable weight on the scales of justice, she knew that sometimes the world needed more than facts to right a wrong. It needed people who would not stop speaking until they were heard. The bailiff's voice rose, calling the court back to order, and Jasmine straightened in her seat, her small shoulders lifting as she prepared herself for the final act of this long battle, her grandfather's hand still wrapped around hers like a silent vow that they would face this last moment together. The judge returned, his face composed, but his eyes holding a glint of something that Jasmine recognized as respect, or perhaps even wonder, and he cleared his throat as the jurors began to file back in, their faces solemn, the weight of their responsibility settling around them like a cloak. Jasmine watched them with a calm that came from somewhere deep inside her, a place that had grown from every whispered story her grandfather had shared, every quiet hour spent learning how to see the world as it truly was rather than how it pretended to be. And in that calm was the knowledge that no matter what the judge decided, she had already done the most important thing. She had shown them all that her grandfather was not the man they had tried to paint him as. And so, as the room grew still again and the judge prepared to speak, Jasmine reached out and placed her small hand over her grandfather's, her fingers fitting neatly between his, and she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "Whatever happens next, Grandpa, I know who you are, and I know they do too." In that moment, beneath the vaulted ceiling and the weight of history that had always seemed to press down on people like them, Jasmine felt something like hope flicker to life, soft and fragile, but bright enough to banish the last lingering shadows of doubt. As the judge adjusted his glasses and let his gaze sweep across the courtroom, the wooden gavel resting on the bench seemed to hold a quiet gravity that pulled everyone's attention in like a tide, and Jasmine felt her small hand tighten around her grandfather's calloused fingers. Her breath shallow but steady, because in that moment she understood that this was the final turn in the road they had walked together. Every word she had spoken, every truth she had unearthed, had led to this single point, this breathless instant when everything they had carried on their backs was about to be weighed and measured in the scales of justice. The judge's voice, when he finally spoke, was soft but resonant, each syllable cutting through the hush of the room with a calm authority that made even the restless shuffle of papers and coughs of reporters fade to nothing. And he said, "This court has listened with great care to the testimony of Miss Jasmine Williams, and to the evidence she has so meticulously gathered and presented. And it is clear to me, and to this court, that what she has shown us cannot be dismissed or disregarded." His eyes pausing to rest on Jasmine for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, the weight of that gaze both comforting and humbling as he continued. The allegations brought against Robert Williams were serious and would have demanded the highest standard of proof, regardless of who stood accused. But what we have seen here is a case built not on truth or diligence, but on a pattern of carelessness, of prejudice, and of outright deception. Jasmine felt the air leave her lungs in a slow exhale, her small shoulders relaxing even as her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the pulse of her grandfather's relief in the trembling of his hand beneath hers. The judge turned then to Richardson, who sat frozen in his chair, his face pale and eyes cast down, and the judge's voice, though still measured, carried an edge of iron as he said, "Mr. Richardson, the evidence has shown that not only did you fail to investigate this case thoroughly, but you also acted in direct conflict with your duties as a prosecutor, undermining the very foundation of justice you were sworn to uphold." There was a murmur in the gallery then, a ripple of sound that rose and fell like a quiet wave, but Jasmine barely heard it, her ears filled with the steady drum of her own heartbeat, as she watched the man who had tried so hard to bury her grandfather's name shrink in the face of his own unraveling lies. The judge paused, his fingers drumming lightly on the bench as he let the weight of his words settle, and then he said, "As such, this court finds that the charges against Robert Williams are to be dismissed immediately and without prejudice, and that an investigation into the conduct of Mr. Richardson and his office will be referred to the appropriate authorities." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat, a small, choked sob of relief that she quickly swallowed back, her dark eyes turning to meet her grandfather's as his own tears began to gather, glistening in the harsh courtroom lights but unashamed, because they were not tears of defeat but of vindication, of a burden finally lifted after too many long days of carrying it alone. She felt his hand squeeze hers, the pressure of it grounding her in the moment as she blinked back her own tears, her heart a fierce, steady drumbeat in her chest. The judge's voice softened then, the stern lines of his face easing into something almost gentle as he looked back at Jasmine, and he said, "Miss Williams, this court owes you a debt of gratitude, not just for your diligence and intelligence, but for the courage you have shown in standing up for what is right, even when it seemed impossible. Your voice has reminded us all of the power of truth spoken plainly, and of the strength that can come from the smallest hands." Jasmine ducked her head for a moment, a shy smile ghosting across her lips as she whispered, "Thank you, Your Honor." And in that small, humble phrase lay all the battles she had fought in the quiet corners of her mind, every night she had spent with her flashlight and her notebook, every breathless moment when she had wondered if anyone would ever believe a little girl who refused to be silent. The judge nodded once, then lifted the gavel and brought it down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom like a final chord of music, and in that sound, Jasmine heard the shattering of every lie that had tried to drown her grandfather's name. The courtroom erupted in a soft murmur of voices, some awed, some simply relieved, and Jasmine turned to her grandfather, their eyes meeting in a silent conversation that needed no words at all. She had kept her promise, and he had never once let go of his faith in her. She leaned into his side, her small frame pressing against his larger one, and in that moment, the two of them were an island of quiet strength in a sea of murmurs and shifting feet, the bond between them stronger than any chain of lies that had tried to break them. And in that fleeting golden instant, Jasmine knew that this was not the end of their story, but the beginning of something new, something bright and unshakable that no one could ever take from them. As the courtroom doors swung open and the reporters surged forward, their cameras and microphones poised to capture the final chapter of a story that had begun as a simple accusation and had blossomed into a testament to the quiet power of a child's love and a family's unshakable bond, Jasmine felt the swirl of voices around her like the hum of a distant storm. But she kept her hand firmly wrapped in her grandfather's, her small fingers clutching his weathered palm, with the certainty that whatever storms might come next, they would weather them together. Her grandfather's deep, warm voice bent low to her ear, a murmur of pride and relief as he said, "You did it, Jasmine. You reminded them all what truth looks like when it stands tall, no matter how small the shoulders it rests on." And she turned her face up to his, a shy smile breaking across her lips as she whispered back, "I learned it from you, Grandpa. You taught me that honesty doesn't need a loud voice, just a brave one." The reporters clamored for statements, their questions a blur of noise and flashing lights. But Jasmine didn't need to answer them, not really, because the truth had already been spoken where it mattered most, in the still sacred quiet of the courtroom where her grandfather's name had been cleared and his dignity restored. They walked out together, side by side, past the cameras and the eager eyes, and Jasmine felt the sun on her face like a gentle promise that the world outside those heavy oak doors was waiting for them, ready to be seen through new eyes. In the days that followed, word of her courage spread far beyond Brooklyn. Newspapers ran headlines about the 8-year-old girl who had stunned a courtroom and exposed a prosecutor's lies, and strangers sent letters to the community center, letters filled with words of hope and admiration, and quiet prayers that justice might always find such a fierce and gentle champion. Jasmine didn't care about the attention, though. What mattered was the way her grandfather walked a little taller now, the way his shoulders no longer seemed weighed down by doubt, the way he smiled at her in the quiet evenings when the sun dipped low and the sky turned soft and golden. Mrs. Harriet came to visit them one evening, her smile warm as she handed Jasmine a stack of new books, and she said, "You showed them all, Jasmine. You showed them that even the smallest voice can carry the weight of truth when it refuses to be silenced." And Jasmine hugged her tight, the quiet strength of that embrace a promise that she would never stop asking questions, never stop seeking out the stories that needed to be told. In the weeks that followed, the community center reopened its doors, the rooms filled once more with the sound of laughter and the gentle shuffle of children's feet. And Jasmine would often sit with her grandfather at the long wooden table where they had once sorted blue and yellow receipts, their heads bent together over new plans and new hopes. And in those moments, she understood that justice wasn't something that lived only in courtrooms or behind high benches. It lived in every choice they made, every promise they kept, every hand they reached out to hold when the world felt too big or too cruel. The judge, too, had not forgotten her. He sent a letter weeks later, a note of quiet thanks and careful script, telling her that her courage had reminded him why he had chosen to sit behind that bench all those years ago. And Jasmine folded the letter and kept it tucked in her dresser drawer, a small treasure to remind her that even the smallest ripples can reach far beyond what any of them can see. Richardson, stripped of his title and his arrogance, faced his own reckoning in the months that followed, an investigation that would not be stopped by the lies he had tried to weave, and Jasmine felt no anger towards him now, only a quiet certainty that the truth would always rise, even if it took time. And as summer turned to fall, and the leaves outside their window turned to gold and flame, Jasmine would sometimes sit by the window, her notebook open on her lap, her pen scratching out new questions and new stories, and her grandfather would sit beside her, his quiet presence a promise that she would never have to search alone. In those small, perfect moments, Jasmine understood that justice wasn't the end of a story. It was the seed of 100 more, and she was ready to plant every single one of them, her small voice carrying the bright, fierce echo of every child who had ever dared to speak the truth. And in that simple certainty, Jasmine found her peace, a peace built not on the shouts of those who had tried to silence her, but on the soft, steady rhythm of her own heart and the knowledge that when you stand for what is right, no matter how small you are, you can never truly be alone. As the echoes of that day in the Brooklyn courtroom slowly faded into the past, Jasmine Williams carried forward the quiet certainty that had guided her every word. That truth, no matter how small or soft-spoken, can reshape the world when it refuses to be silenced. Her grandfather's name, once weighed down by suspicion, now rose unburdened and proud, and in that journey, from the dusty corners of a library to the unwavering stand of a witness box, Jasmine had proven something timeless, that love is a force that bends even the strongest walls of doubt, and that justice, when spoken from the heart, can be louder than any lie. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below, subscribe for more true stories of courage and hope, and let us all remember, sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with the smallest voices.